My parents helped my younger brother buy his dream house, then looked me in the eyes and told me to just rent somewhere. After years of sacrificing, struggling, and surviving completely alone, I realized something painful. Being the responsible child in my family never earned love, it only made me easier to ignore. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let me ask you to subscribe, like, and share. In the comments section, tell us which city you live in. When I was growing up, my parents constantly reminded everyone around us that they treated my brother and me exactly the same. They loved repeating it during family gatherings, especially in front of relatives or family friends. My mom would smile proudly and say things like, "We never play favorites," while my dad nodded along as if it were some important family principle. For most of my childhood, I believed them without questioning it. I wanted to believe it because, honestly, what kid wants to think their parents value one child more than the other? So whenever something felt unfair, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe my brother needed more attention at the time. Maybe I was simply more mature. Maybe life was just uneven sometimes. That became the story I repeated in my head for years because accepting the alternative felt too painful. Looking back now, though, the pattern seems painfully obvious. My brother was always protected from consequences in ways I never was. If he forgot an assignment at school, my parents blamed the teacher for putting too much pressure on students. If I forgot something, I got lectured about responsibility and discipline. When he wrecked his first car after driving recklessly with his friends, my parents immediately helped him replace it because they said he was already stressed enough. Meanwhile, when my car broke down during college, I had to work extra shifts for months just to afford repairs. Every time I struggled, I was told it would make me stronger. Every time he struggled, someone rushed in to rescue him before things became uncomfortable. First, I didn't see it as favoritism because the differences were always wrapped in excuses that sounded reasonable in the moment. My parents framed everything as circumstance, never preference. As we got older, the gap between us became even harder to ignore. My brother moved through life with this invisible safety net underneath him. If he lost a job, my parents covered his bills until he found another one. If he overspent money, they helped him catch up. If he wanted to try something new, they encouraged him financially and emotionally without hesitation. I, on the other hand, learned very quickly that asking for help usually came with disappointment. By the time I was in my early 20s, I stopped asking altogether. I worked overtime constantly, lived in tiny apartments with leaking ceilings and unreliable heating, and stretched every paycheck until there was almost nothing left. I told myself I should feel proud for being independent, but deep down I envied how effortlessly supported my brother seemed to be. It wasn't even about the money most of the time. It was the feeling behind it. He always had somewhere soft to land, while I felt like I had been pushed into adulthood with no cushion at all. Even with all those feelings buried inside me, I still tried to maintain peace in the family. I showed up to birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners pretending everything felt normal. I laughed at the same jokes, listened to the same stories, and ignored the growing bitterness sitting quietly in the back of my mind. Part of me kept hoping I was wrong about everything. I wanted one clear moment that proved my parents really did see us equally. Instead, the moment that finally shattered that hope came years later, when my brother proudly announced that he had bought his first house, and my parents revealed exactly how much they had done to make it happen. First, I was honestly happy for my brother. When he invited everyone over for dinner that weekend, I assumed it was just another casual family gathering. My mom had cooked one of those oversized meals she always made whenever there was good news, though nobody told me what the occasion actually was. The moment I walked into the house, I could already feel this strange excitement in the air. My brother was practically glowing with confidence, pacing around the kitchen with a grin he could barely contain. My dad kept pouring drinks for everyone while my mom repeatedly told us to sit down because she had something special to celebrate. I remember thinking maybe my brother got promoted at work or finally paid off some debt. Buying a house never even crossed my mind because, as far as I knew, he was struggling financially only a few months earlier. The announcement came halfway through dinner. My brother suddenly pulled out his phone and said, "I guess I should finally show everybody the place." Then he started passing his phone around the table with photos of a beautiful two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had a huge backyard, modern appliances, polished hardwood floors, and one of those large kitchen islands people post online like some kind of life achievement. Everyone immediately exploded with excitement. My mom nearly started crying from happiness while my dad proudly slapped my brother on the shoulder like he had just accomplished something extraordinary completely on his own. My aunt kept saying things like, "You're so young to own a home nowadays," while my cousins looked genuinely impressed. I sat there staring at the pictures, trying to process how any of this made sense financially. The more details my brother shared, the more confused I became. He talked about how competitive the housing market was and how lucky he felt to secure the property so quickly. But what caught my attention was how casually he mentioned things that most first-time buyers struggle with for years: the massive down payment, the closing costs, the renovations he already planned to make before moving in. None of it sounded realistic for someone who constantly complained about barely making rent. Finally, my mom laughed and said, "Well, he couldn't have done it without us helping him get started." She said it so proudly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then my dad added, "We covered most of the down payment because the market is impossible right now for young people." Table filled with approving nods and supportive comments while I sat there completely frozen. I tried not to react immediately because I didn't want to ruin the mood, but inside something felt like it cracked open. My mind instantly started replaying years of struggle I had gone through alone. I thought about the tiny apartments I had rented, the nights I worked overtime until exhaustion just to keep up with bills, the dreams of owning a home that I buried because they felt financially impossible. Nobody had ever offered me that kind of help. Nobody had ever sat me down and said they wanted to invest in my future the same way. I kept wondering if maybe there was something I didn't know. Maybe they had secretly helped me in other ways emotionally that I wasn't appreciating. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This was different. Trying to keep my voice calm, I finally asked, "So, you guys helped him buy the house?" The room suddenly became quieter, like everyone sensed tension before I even finished speaking. My mother smiled at me as if the answer was obvious and said, "Of course." He needed support getting started. I remember staring at her, waiting for some acknowledgement that maybe the situation looked unfair. Instead, my dad casually shrugged and said the words that have replayed in my head ever since. "You're independent. You can just rent somewhere." He said it so casually, so effortlessly, like he was commenting on the weather instead of dismissing years of silent sacrifice in a single sentence. Conversation moved on almost immediately afterward, but I barely heard another word for the rest of the night. Everyone else kept celebrating while I sat there realizing that the family I spent years defending had just shown me exactly where I stood in their lives. That sentence stayed in my head long after the dinner ended. "You can just rent somewhere." My dad had said it so casually, almost like it was comforting advice instead of a dismissal. I replayed the moment over and over during the drive home, trying to convince myself I was being too sensitive. Part of me wanted to believe he hadn't meant anything hurtful by it. But the more I thought about those words, the more painful they became. It wasn't simply about housing. It wasn't even really about money anymore. It was the realization that my struggles had always been treated as expected, while my brother's struggles were treated as emergencies worth solving. My independence had somehow become an excuse to leave me unsupported. When I got back to my apartment that night, I sat alone in complete silence for almost an hour. The place suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before. I started noticing every flaw I usually ignored: the stained carpet near the kitchen, the broken cabinet hinge I never had time to fix, the thin walls that let me hear strangers arguing at midnight. I had lived in cramped apartments like this for years, constantly telling myself it was temporary, that eventually all my hard work would lead somewhere stable. But sitting there that night, exhausted and emotionally drained, I realized how long I had been surviving instead of actually living. Meanwhile, my younger brother was preparing to move into a beautiful house with a backyard, extra bedrooms, and financial security handed to him by the same parents who once told me struggling would build character. The anger didn't hit all at once. First, it came in waves mixed with sadness and embarrassment. I kept thinking about every moment I had silently accepted hardship because I believed my parents were treating us equally. During college, I worked double shifts at a grocery store while taking full-time classes because my parents said they couldn't help me financially. I remember surviving on instant noodles for weeks just to stretch my budget far enough to cover rent. When my car broke down during finals week, I had to borrow money from a friend because I already knew asking my parents would only lead to another lecture about responsibility. My brother, meanwhile, changed majors twice, dropped classes constantly, and still had my parents paying portions of his expenses well into adulthood. Back then, I convinced myself it didn't bother me because everyone moves through life differently. But now, all those memories felt different. They no longer looked like isolated situations. They looked like evidence. What hurt the most was realizing how often I had been praised only when I needed nothing from anyone. My parents loved calling me strong, mature, and responsible, especially in comparison to my brother. Relatives would compliment me during holidays, saying things like, "You're the reliable one," while my parents smiled proudly beside me. I used to think those compliments meant they respected me more deeply. Now I started wondering if they simply found me easier to ignore. Being dependable meant nobody worried about whether I was okay. Nobody checked if I was overwhelmed, lonely, or exhausted because I had built this reputation of handling everything myself. Meanwhile, my brother received constant attention precisely because he struggled more openly. Somewhere along the line, I became the child people assumed would survive no matter what, and that assumption quietly turned into emotional neglect disguised as admiration. Over the next few days, the resentment kept growing no matter how hard I tried to suppress it. I'd wake up thinking about the house. I'd scroll through social media and see friends my age posting about buying homes, getting married, building stable futures, while I was still calculating whether I could afford a rent increase next year. Every memory connected back to that dinner table. Every sacrifice suddenly felt heavier. I wasn't angry that my brother got help. At least that's what I kept telling myself. If anything, I was angry that I had spent years believing love in my family was unconditional when it now seemed tied to who demanded the most attention. The hardest part was realizing that no matter how successful or responsible I became, it would probably never earn me the same kind of care my brother received automatically. A few days after the dinner, I finally decided I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The anger and disappointment had been sitting inside me non-stop, turning into this heavy feeling I couldn't ignore anymore. I barely slept during those nights because my mind kept replaying every detail from that conversation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the issue was much deeper than a house or financial help. It was years of feeling emotionally invisible while watching my brother receive endless patience, understanding, and support. I knew if I stayed silent any longer, the resentment would only grow worse. So I called my parents and asked if I could come over to talk privately. My mother sounded cheerful on the phone, completely unaware of how serious the conversation would become. Part of me hoped they would finally understand once I explained how hurt I felt. Another part of me already feared they would dismiss me again. When I arrived at their house, everything felt strangely normal at first. My dad was sitting in the living room watching television while my mom cleaned dishes in the kitchen. The ordinary atmosphere almost made me question whether bringing it up was a mistake. But eventually my mom noticed how quiet I was and asked if something was wrong. That was the moment everything finally came out. I told them I had been deeply hurt by the conversation at dinner and that hearing them help my brother buy a house while telling me to just rent somewhere made me feel like I mattered less in the family. I tried to stay calm and respectful because I genuinely wanted them to understand my perspective instead of turning the conversation into a fight. I explained that it wasn't really about the money itself. It was about feeling unsupported for most of my adult life while constantly watching my brother receive help every time he struggled. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, the room became completely silent. My mother crossed her arms almost immediately, and I could already see defensiveness building on her face before she even responded. She told me I was misunderstanding the situation and insisted they were only helping my brother because he needed assistance more than I did. Then she started listing all the reasons why his situation was supposedly harder: higher stress, unstable finances, difficulty handling pressure. Listening to her explain it felt surreal because it sounded like my struggles had never counted simply because I managed to survive them quietly. My dad eventually sighed and said something that honestly hurt almost as much as the original comment. He told me they had always believed I was the stronger child, the more capable one, and that they were proud I didn't need constant help from them. First glance, those words almost sounded complimentary. But sitting there in that moment, I realized how deeply unfair they actually were. Strength had somehow become the reason I received less love, less support, and less care. I asked them directly whether they understood how painful it felt to watch my brother receive opportunities one could only dream about after years of working myself into exhaustion. I reminded them about the times I struggled financially during college, the apartments I lived in, the overtime shifts, the nights I skipped meals to save money. My mother responded by saying those experiences made me who I am today, as if suffering was some valuable gift they had intentionally given me. Meanwhile, whenever my brother faced even temporary discomfort, they rushed to protect him from consequences before he ever truly experienced hardship. Conversation became more tense with every minute. I could feel years of buried resentment surfacing faster than I could control it. For the first time in my life, I admitted out loud that I often felt like my role in the family was simply to be self-sufficient so everyone else could focus on my brother. My dad immediately denied that accusation and told me I was being dramatic. My mother accused me of turning a happy family moment into unnecessary conflict out of jealousy. Hearing the word jealous made something inside me snap emotionally because they still refused to understand the real issue. I didn't want my brother to lose his house. I didn't even want the money anymore. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted someone to admit that maybe, just maybe, I had been carrying more emotional pain than anyone realized. Instead, every attempt to explain myself only seemed to make them more defensive. By the time I left their house that evening, I felt emotionally exhausted in a way I can barely describe. The entire drive home felt numb and surreal. I had gone there hoping for understanding, maybe even an apology, but instead I walked away feeling more alone than ever. What hurt most was realizing my parents genuinely believed they had done nothing wrong. In their minds, helping my brother while leaving me to struggle alone was proof of fairness because I was supposedly better equipped to handle life. But all I could think about was how lonely it feels when the people who are supposed to protect you mistake your silence for strength and your independence for a reason not to care. A few days after my conversation with my parents, things became even worse when my brother finally found out I was upset about the situation. Apparently, my mother had called him almost immediately after I left their house and told him I was taking everything personally. I should have known that would happen. In my family, private conversations never stayed private for long, especially when conflict involved my brother. Still, part of me hoped he might reach out calmly and try to understand why I felt hurt. Maybe he would acknowledge that the situation looked unfair from my perspective. Maybe he would recognize how different our experiences had been growing up. Instead, the moment he called me, I could already hear irritation in his voice before I even answered properly. He didn't ask how I was feeling or why the situation affected me so deeply. He immediately sounded defensive, like my emotions were some kind of attack against him personally. The first thing he said was, "So you're really mad that Mom and Dad helped me?" I tried to explain carefully that I wasn't angry he received support. I told him the issue was years of unequal treatment and the painful realization that I had always been expected to struggle alone while he received help whenever life became difficult. But every sentence I said seemed to make him more frustrated. He accused me of acting bitter because I wasn't the center of attention for once. Then he laughed sarcastically and said, "You've always had your life together better than me anyway, so why are you acting like the victim now?" Hearing that instantly brought back years of buried frustration. People in my family constantly used my independence as proof that I didn't deserve the same level of care or support. Somehow, because I managed my responsibilities quietly, everyone assumed I was emotionally unaffected by the pressure. My brother continued talking like my feelings were irrational. He said our parents helped him because he actually needed it, while I was fully capable of taking care of myself. According to him, I should feel proud that our parents trusted me enough to survive on my own. But the way he framed it made me feel invisible all over again. I didn't want praise for surviving without support. I wanted the same sense of security and emotional reassurance he had always received automatically. As the conversation continued, I realized my brother genuinely viewed our childhood completely differently than I did. In his mind, our parents' constant rescuing was simply normal parenting. He never questioned why he was repeatedly protected from consequences because he had grown used to someone stepping in whenever life became uncomfortable. He told me I was overthinking everything and insisted our parents loved us equally. But love without fairness eventually starts feeling conditional. I tried explaining how exhausting it was to spend years pretending I was fine because nobody seemed interested in what I was carrying emotionally. I told him there were moments during college and early adulthood when I felt completely overwhelmed, but I stopped reaching out because I already knew the response would be another lecture about responsibility instead of actual help. What hurt the most was how quickly he dismissed all of it. Instead of listening, he accused me of being jealous of his success. He said I should stop comparing our lives because everyone struggles differently. That part almost made me laugh because I had spent years doing the exact opposite, minimizing my own pain so nobody would feel uncomfortable. Meanwhile, my brother openly depended on our parents financially and emotionally without shame, and somehow I was still the one being labeled selfish for finally speaking honestly. At one point he even said, "Maybe Mom and Dad help me more because I actually appreciate them." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. After everything I had sacrificed to maintain peace in the family, after years of showing up for birthdays, holidays, emergencies, and responsibilities without complaint, hearing him imply I was somehow less grateful felt devastating. By the end of the call, I could barely recognize the relationship we used to have. Growing up, despite our differences, I always believed my brother and I were still on the same side underneath everything. But listening to him defend the favoritism so casually made me realize he benefited from it too much to ever question it honestly. Why would he? From his perspective, the system worked perfectly. He received support, protection, financial help, emotional reassurance, and endless second chances. I was the one carrying the emotional cost of staying strong all the time. When the call finally ended, I sat there staring at my phone in complete silence. For the first time in my life, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining the imbalance in my family. The painful truth was finally impossible to ignore. My role had never been to receive support. My role was to survive quietly so everyone else could keep believing the family was fair. After that phone call with my brother, something inside me changed permanently. It wasn't one dramatic moment where I suddenly cut everyone off or exploded in anger. It was quieter than that, almost numb at first. I simply stopped reaching out as much. I stopped being the first person to text in the family group chat. I stopped calling my parents during random evenings just to check in. When holidays approached, instead of feeling excited or comforted, I felt emotionally exhausted before the gatherings even happened. Every interaction suddenly carried this invisible tension underneath it, like I had finally seen something I could never unsee. For years, I had worked so hard to preserve the image of a close, loving family that I ignored how emotionally lonely I actually felt inside it. First, my parents acted confused about why I had become distant. My mother would send short messages asking if everything was okay, followed by passive-aggressive comments about how families shouldn't drift apart over misunderstandings. My father avoided addressing the issue directly altogether, pretending things were normal whenever we spoke. Meanwhile, my brother acted like nothing significant had happened. He occasionally sent photos of house renovations or furniture deliveries into the family chat as if we were all supposed to celebrate together. Every time those pictures appeared on my phone, I felt this painful mix of resentment, guilt, and sadness that I didn't fully know how to process. I hated feeling bitter because bitterness wasn't who I wanted to become. But ignoring my emotions for years was exactly what had brought me to this point in the first place. The hardest part was realizing how deeply the situation affected my sense of self-worth. I started questioning memories I once viewed positively. Moments that used to make me feel proud now felt strangely hollow. I had always believed being responsible, hardworking, and independent would eventually earn respect and emotional security within my family. Instead, it felt like those qualities had unintentionally made me easier to overlook. The more dependable I became, the less anyone worried about whether I needed support too. Somewhere along the way, my emotional needs disappeared behind the role I had been assigned: the stable child, the capable child, the one who could handle disappointment without falling apart. But people don't stop needing care simply because they learn how to survive quietly. I spent weeks going back and forth in my head, wondering whether I was overreacting. Some days I convinced myself I should just let everything go because families are imperfect and life isn't always equal. Other days I felt furious remembering all the sacrifices I made while being told struggle would make me stronger. I thought about the tiny apartments, the financial stress, the overtime shifts, the loneliness, and the constant pressure to succeed without asking anyone for help. Then I compared it to how naturally support flowed toward my brother whenever he faced obstacles. The imbalance wasn't imaginary anymore. It had become impossible to deny. What hurt most was not the financial difference itself, but the emotional message underneath it. My pain had always been considered more acceptable because I carried it quietly. As time passed, I slowly stopped expecting validation from any of them. That realization was painful but strangely freeing too. I understood that no conversation would suddenly make my parents admit years of favoritism. No argument would make my brother see the situation through my eyes because his entire experience within the family was built on receiving the very support I lacked. Waiting for them to fully understand me was only keeping me emotionally trapped. So instead, I started focusing on something I had neglected for years: myself. I began setting boundaries, protecting my peace, and allowing myself to acknowledge emotions I used to suppress automatically. For the first time, I admitted that constantly being the strong one had exhausted me far more than I ever allowed anyone to see. Even now, part of me still grieves the version of my family I thought existed when I was younger. I miss believing that love automatically meant fairness, safety, and equal care. Losing that illusion feels strangely similar to losing a home itself. But at the same time, I'm beginning to understand something important. Being independent should never mean being undeserving of compassion. Strength should not require emotional isolation. And just because I learned how to survive without support does not mean I was never hurt by the absence of it. I don't hate my brother for receiving help, and I don't wake up wishing failure on my family. What I wanted, what I think I always wanted, was simply acknowledgement. I wanted someone to look at my years of silent struggle and finally say, "You deserved support too."